When you think of the Pope, you probably imagine an elderly man in white robes, blessing crowds from a balcony, living in luxury in the Vatican. Pretty cushy job, right? Well, let me stop you right there, because being Pope in the Middle Ages was less Holy Father and more holy crap, I'm probably going to die horribly. Today, we're diving into one of history's most terrifying job positions, medieval pope. Forget workplace stress about deadlines or difficult bosses. Try having multiple kings wanting you dead, your own cardinals plotting to poison you, anti-popes claiming your throne, and angry mobs literally digging up your predecessor's corpse to put it on trial. Yes, that actually happened. From the year 500 to 1500, being pope meant navigating assassination attempts, exile, imprisonment, and occasionally being strangled with your own papal vestments. Out of roughly 150 popes during this period, dozens died violently, mysteriously, or in circumstances that would make a Game of Thrones writer say, okay, that's a bit much. So grab your favorite beverage, make sure it's not poison, and let's explore why wearing the papal tiara in the Middle Ages was basically signing your own death warrant. First, let's understand what being a medieval pope actually meant. You weren't just a spiritual leader, you were a king, a judge, a general, a diplomat, and a CEO all rolled into one. The pope ruled the papal states, a chunk of central Italy about the size of Switzerland. That meant collecting taxes, raising armies, and defending borders. But wait, there's more. You were also supposedly the spiritual authority over all of Western Christianity. Every king, emperor, and noble theoretically answered to you in matters of faith. I say theoretically because in practice, telling a king he was wrong about anything was a great way to end up dead. The Pope claimed the power to excommunicate anyone, basically cutting them off from the church and condemning their soul to hell. Sounds powerful, right? Well, it was, unless the person you excommunicated had an army, then it just made them angry. You also controlled church appointments across Europe. Every bishop, every abbot, every important church position needed papal approval. This meant every ambitious noble wanted to be your best friend, or wanted you dead so they could install someone more cooperative. And here's the kicker. There was no retirement plan. Once you were Pope, you were Pope until you died. No stepping down, no vacation days, no, I'm too old for this. You literally worked until death, which given the job hazards usually came sooner rather than later. The papal court was a snake pit of competing factions. Italian noble families like the Crescenti, Tuscolani, and later the Orsini and Colonna treated the papacy like their personal property. Cardinals weren't holy men focused on prayer. They were political operators with private armies. Your own curia could be plotting against you before the white smoke even cleared. Oh, and did I mention you were also expected to be celibate? That's right, no wife, no legitimate heirs, no family to watch your back. Just you, alone, surrounded by people who wanted your job and would do literally anything to get it. Let's start with one of the darkest and strangest periods in papal history, the Saeculum Obscurum, better known as the Pornocracy. Yes, that's actually what historians call it. From roughly 904 to 964, the papacy was controlled by a powerful Roman family, particularly its women. Meet Marozia, possibly the most powerful woman you've never heard of. She was the mistress of Pope Sergius III, mother of Pope John XI, grandmother of Pope John XII, and personally ordered the imprisonment and murder of Pope John X. She basically treated the papacy like her personal appointment book. Imagine being Pope during this period. You're not chosen for your holiness or wisdom. You're chosen because Marozia thinks you'll do what she wants. Cross her, and you'll end up like Pope John X, who made the fatal mistake of trying to actually be independent. He was thrown in prison and smothered with a pillow. Pope Stephen VI had it even worse, though he kind of deserved it. In 897, he dug up the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, and put it on trial. Yes, you heard that right. They dressed the rotting corpse in papal vestments, propped it up on a throne, and held a trial. A deacon was appointed to speak for the corpse. Shockingly, the dead pope was found guilty. But karma's a bitch. Stephen VI was thrown in prison by an angry mob and strangled to death a few months later. Being the pope who puts a corpse on trial apparently doesn't win you many friends. Then there was Pope John XII, Marozia's grandson, who became pope at the ripe old age of 18. Contemporary accounts describe him as turning the papal palace into a brothel. He was accused of castrating a cardinal, toasting the devil, and invoking pagan gods while gambling. He allegedly died in the act of adultery, either thrown out a window by a jealous husband or struck down by a stroke. Either way, not exactly a holy death. During this period, the average papal reign was about 4 years. Some lasted mere months. Pope Leo V ruled for 30 days before being thrown in prison and murdered. His successor, Christopher, lasted 4 months before meeting the same fate. Being Pope meant constantly looking over your shoulder, testing your food for poison, and wondering if today was the day your own cardinals would strangle you in your sleep. If you thought dealing with Roman noble families was bad, wait until you hear about the Holy Roman Emperors. The investiture controversy was basically a century-long cage match between popes and emperors over who got to appoint bishops. Sounds boring? It wasn't if you were the Pope getting kidnapped. The conflict came to a head with Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. Gregory had the audacity to say that maybe, just maybe, the Pope should have a say in who became a bishop. Henry disagreed, strongly. In 1076, Gregory excommunicated Henry. Henry responded by declaring Gregory deposed and installing his own pope, Clement III. Now there were 2 popes, each backed by different armies. This became a recurring theme. Whenever a pope annoyed a king or emperor too much, boom, suddenly there's an anti-pope. Gregory ended up fleeing Rome and dying in exile. His last words were reportedly, "I have loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." Not exactly a ringing endorsement for the job, but it gets worse. Pope Paschal II was literally kidnapped by Henry V in 1111. Imagine being the most powerful religious leader in Western Europe, and some 20-something emperor just takes you prisoner. Paschal was forced to crown Henry and give him everything he wanted before being released. Pope Gelasius II spent his entire 13-month papacy on the run. The moment he was elected, Roman nobles attacked the conclave. He was beaten, kicked, and thrown in prison. He escaped, fled Rome, got chased around Italy by imperial forces, and finally died in France, having barely spent any time in Rome at all. Pope Lucius II decided to take a more direct approach. He personally led an armed assault on the Roman capital. He was hit in the head with a rock and died from his injuries. Yes, a pope died from combat wounds received while personally leading a military assault. Try explaining that at the pearly gates. The message was clear. Excommunicate the wrong person and you might find yourself fleeing for your life, imprisoned, or worse. The spiritual power of excommunication only worked if the person you excommunicated cared about their soul more than their earthly power. Spoiler alert, most didn't. By 1309, things had gotten so bad in Rome that Pope Clement V just didn't go there. He stayed in France, setting up shop in Avignon. For the next 68 years, 7 popes ruled from what critics called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Now, you might think being in France would be safer than Rome. Wrong. Being in Avignon meant you were essentially a puppet of the French king. The French controlled access to the Pope, influenced papal decisions, and made sure church money flowed into French coffers. The Avignon popes lived in luxury. The papal palace in Avignon was one of the largest Gothic buildings in Europe, but golden cages are still cages. These popes were trapped between French demands and the fury of the rest of Europe, which saw them as French puppets. Pope John XXII, paranoid about assassination, had all his food tested for poison. He was so terrified of magic that he issued a papal bull against witchcraft, convinced sorcerers were trying to kill him with wax dolls. He might have been paranoid, but when you're pope, even paranoid delusions have a way of becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. Then came the Western Schism, which made everything infinitely worse. In 1378, the cardinals elected Urban VI, who turned out to be completely insane. He tortured cardinals who disagreed with him and allegedly complained that their screams weren't loud enough. The cardinals decided they'd made a mistake and elected a different pope, Clement VII. Now, there were 2 popes, not an anti-pope situation. 2 groups of legitimately elected popes, each with their own cardinals, their own curia, their own claims to legitimacy. Catholic Europe split down the middle. France recognized Clement, Italy recognized Urban. Every kingdom had to pick a side. It got worse. In 1409, cardinals from both sides met at the Council of Pisa to solve the problem. Their solution? Elect a 3rd pope, because clearly the solution to having 2 popes is to add another one. Now there were 3 people claiming to be the legitimate pope. Imagine being one of these popes. You're not even sure if you're the real pope. A third of Europe thinks you're a pretender. Another third thinks you're the Antichrist. Wars are being fought over which pope to recognize. And somewhere out there are 2 other guys with equal claim to your throne. The schism finally ended in 1417, but the damage was done. The papacy's reputation was in tatters. Being pope no longer meant universal recognition. It meant being one of several claimants in a job that might not even be legitimate. So you've somehow become pope in the Middle Ages. Congratulations, you're now the target of every ambitious cardinal, angry noble, and rival claimant in Europe. How do you survive? Let's look at the medieval pope's guide to not dying horribly. First, food tasters. Lots of them. Poison was the weapon of choice for papal assassins. Pope Benedict XI probably died from poisoned figs. Pope Clement XIV was allegedly poisoned by the Jesuits, though that's debated. Your official food taster wasn't enough. You needed backup tasters for your tasters. Second, never trust your cardinals. The College of Cardinals was supposed to be your advisory body. In reality, each cardinal was a potential replacement plotting your demise. Pope Formosus was probably poisoned by cardinals. Pope Stephen VI definitely was. Keep your friends close and your cardinals at sword's length. Third, have your own army, not just the spiritual army of Christ, actual soldiers. Pope Julius II personally led papal armies into battle wearing armor. He was known as the warrior pope and survived multiple assassination attempts, partly because would-be killers knew he'd literally fight back. Fourth, strategic illness. Several clever popes survived by pretending to be sicker than they were. Enemies are less likely to poison someone who's already dying. Pope Gregory X used this strategy, appearing frail and weak while actually being quite healthy. Fifth, exile yourself before someone else does. If things got too hot in Rome, smart popes got out. Pope Innocent II spent 8 years wandering around Europe because Rome was too dangerous. Better to be a living pope in exile than a dead pope in the Vatican. Sixth, create your own nobles. Can't trust the existing Roman nobility? Make new ones. Several popes elevated their own supporters to counter established families. Of course, this created new enemies, but at least they were enemies who owed you something. Seventh, the buddy system. Never go anywhere alone. Pope Lucius II might have survived if he hadn't personally led that assault. Popes who stayed surrounded by guards and officials tended to live longer than those who tried to be hands-on leaders. Let's talk about the various horrible ways medieval popes met their end, because peacefully in his sleep was definitely not the norm. Let's talk about the various horrible ways medieval popes met their end, because peacefully in his sleep was definitely not the norm. Strangulation was popular. Pope Stephen VI, Pope Leo V, Pope Christopher, and Pope John XIV all got the silk rope treatment. There's something particularly twisted about being strangled with the same materials used to make your holy vestments. Imprisonment leading to death was another favorite. Pope John XIV was thrown in Castel Sant'Angelo and starved to death. Pope Benedict XVI was imprisoned and strangled. Pope John X died in prison, probably smothered. Apparently keeping popes in dungeons until they died was standard operating procedure. Then there were the mysterious sudden illnesses. Pope Adrian IV allegedly choked on a fly in his wine, which sounds like the medieval equivalent of he fell down the stairs onto a knife. Pope Clement II died of lead poisoning, which was probably not from his paint hobby. Some popes got creative deaths. Pope John XXI was a scholar who built himself a study. The ceiling collapsed on him. He survived for days, horribly injured before finally dying. Lesson: stick to theology, leave architecture to the professionals. Pope Formosus got the worst treatment. Even death didn't stop his suffering. After the Cadaver Synod, where his corpse was tried and convicted, they cut off the fingers he used for blessings and threw his body in the Tiber River. Being dead apparently wasn't enough to escape papal politics. Urban VI might have been murdered by being fed ground diamonds. Medieval assassination theory held that diamond dust would lacerate your intestines, causing an agonizing death. Whether it works or not, the fact that people thought it did tells you everything about papal dining experiences. And then there were the battlefield deaths. Pope Lucius II dying from combat wounds. Pope Martin I was arrested, tried for treason, and exiled to Crimea, where he died of starvation and mistreatment. Being pope meant you might die as a warrior, a prisoner, or anything in between. Let's get into the mindset. What was it actually like psychologically to be pope during these centuries? First, the paranoia must have been overwhelming. Every meal could be your last. Every cardinal could be plotting against you. Every noble who kissed your ring might be planning to strangle you with it. The constant stress would break most people. Then there was the impossible position of claiming universal authority while having very limited actual power. You're supposedly God's representative on earth, but you need permission from local nobles to leave your own palace. You can excommunicate kings, but they can install their own popes. The cognitive dissonance must have been maddening. The isolation was total. No family, no real friends, surrounded by people who wanted your job. Previous friendships became liabilities. Your former allies were now potential usurpers. Every relationship was transactional, and some popes clearly cracked under the pressure. Urban VI's sadistic torture of cardinals suggests a complete mental breakdown. John XII's debauchery might have been a coping mechanism. If you're going to die horribly anyway, might as well enjoy yourself first. Others became incredibly cynical. The Borgia popes treated the position as purely political, abandoning any pretense of holiness. When survival is your primary concern, spiritual matters take a back seat. The few who tried to be genuinely holy reformers usually ended up dead or exiled. Gregory VII died in exile. Celestine V abdicated after 5 months and was probably murdered by his successor. Being a good person was actively dangerous in this job. The great Roman noble families treated the papacy like a particularly valuable piece in their power games. The Crescenti, Tuscolani, Frangipani, Pierleoni, Orsini, and Colonna families dominated different periods, each viewing the papal throne as their birthright. Being pope meant navigating these family rivalries. Support the Orsini too much, and the Colonna would rebel. Favor the Colonna, and the Orsini would make your life hell. Try to be neutral, and both would turn against you. The Tuscolani family managed to control the papacy for decades in the 11th century. Benedict VIII, John XIX, and Benedict IX were all Tusculani. Benedict IX became pope at somewhere between 11 and 20 years old. Records are unclear. Was driven out of Rome multiple times and allegedly sold the papacy to his godfather. He might have been pope 3 separate times. It's confusing even for historians. These families had private armies. When they fought, Rome became a battlefield. Popes regularly fled the city when noble feuds erupted. Churches were fortified, turned into castles. The Vatican wasn't a peaceful religious center. It was a military stronghold. The families also intermarried with royalty across Europe, creating vast networks of influence. Being pope meant every decision affected someone's cousin, brother-in-law, or uncle. Family loyalty trumped religious duty every time. Popes from these families were expected to enrich their relatives. Nepotism wasn't just common, it was expected. If you became pope and didn't immediately make your nephews cardinals and give your family lucrative positions, your own family might turn against you. But coming from a powerful family was no guarantee of safety. Family feuds could be the deadliest. Your own relatives might poison you if they thought another family member would be a better pope. Blood might be thicker than water, but it wasn't thicker than ambition. Let's dive into some of the absolutely insane but true stories from medieval papal history, because sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The legend of Pope Joan. Allegedly, a woman disguised as a man became pope in the 800s and 50s. According to the legend, she gave birth during a papal procession and was killed on the spot. While historians doubt this actually happened, the fact that medieval people believed it possible tells you something about how chaotic papal succession could be. The pope who sold the papacy, Benedict IX, probably the worst pope ever, actually sold the papal office to his godfather Gregory VI in 1045. Imagine putting the papacy on medieval eBay. Gregory thought he was doing a good thing by buying out a terrible pope, but selling church offices was simony, a serious sin. He ended up being deposed too. The pope who quit, Celestine V, was a hermit who just wanted to pray in his cave. In 1294, he was elected pope mostly because the cardinals had been deadlocked for 2 years and figured a holy hermit couldn't be worse than their other options. Celestine was so miserable as pope that he issued a decree saying popes could resign, then immediately resigned. His successor, Boniface VIII, allegedly had him murdered to prevent any comeback attempts. The year of 4 popes, 1276. Pope Gregory X died in January. Innocent V became pope and died in June. Adrian V became pope and died in August. John XXI became pope in September and managed to survive until the following year when his study ceiling fell on him. Being elected pope in 1276 was basically a death sentence. The pope who was exhumed and made a saint, then unsainted, Pope Formosus was declared a saint after his death. Then Stephen VI dug him up, put him on trial, and declared all his acts invalid. Then Theodore II reversed that decision. Then Sergius III reversed it again. Formosus spent more time being dug up and reburied than most popes spent alive. The time there were 3 popes fighting over who was the real pope, and a 4th pope showed up. During the Western Schism, with 3 popes already claiming legitimacy, a 4th claimant appeared, Benedict XIV, who was elected by a small group of cardinals in 1424. Even other papal claimants thought this was too much. He eventually gave up, but for a brief moment there were 4 people claiming to be pope. Several medieval popes spent significant time as actual prisoners, because apparently the job wasn't difficult enough already. Pope Silverius, 536 to 537, was accused of treason by the Byzantine general Belisarius, deposed, and exiled to a small island where he starved to death. His crime? Not supporting the Byzantine emperor's theological position strongly enough. Pope Martin I, 649 to 655, had it even worse. He opposed the Byzantine emperor's religious policies and was arrested, brought to Constantinople, publicly humiliated, and exiled to Crimea. He spent his last years in misery, writing letters about lacking basic necessities like food and clothing. The Pope, God's representative on earth, dying of neglect in a foreign prison. Pope Paschal II's kidnapping by Henry V was almost comedic if it weren't so serious. The emperor literally held the pope hostage until he agreed to crown him and give up papal rights. Imagine being forced at sword point to surrender powers you believe came from God himself. During the Avignon period, popes were essentially prisoners of French policy. They lived in a massive palace, but couldn't leave without French permission. Urban V tried to return to Rome in 1367, but was forced back to Avignon by French pressure. Gilded cages are still cages. The anti-pope John XXIII, during the Western Schism, was imprisoned after the Council of Constance. He escaped disguised as a stable boy, but was recaptured. A pope fleeing on horseback dressed as a servant, not exactly maintaining papal dignity. The medieval papacy was incredibly wealthy, which made being pope even more dangerous. The papal states generated huge revenues. Church taxes flowed in from across Europe. The pope controlled vast estates and properties. All this wealth made the position a target for anyone with debts to pay or ambitions to fund. Simony, selling church offices, was rampant. Cardinals would literally bid for the papacy. The winner would then need to recoup their investment by selling lower offices. It was a pyramid scheme with the pope at the top, and everyone involved had financial incentives to remove uncooperative popes. The banking families of Florence, like the Medici, would loan money to papal candidates. If your candidate won, you controlled papal finances. If they lost, you might assassinate the winner and try again. Popes who tried to reform church finances often died mysteriously. Crusades were particularly dangerous financially. Popes who called crusades needed to fund them. This meant heavy taxes, which made enemies. It meant owing favors to kings who provided troops. It meant angry nobles who lost money and men in failed ventures. Urban II might have launched the first crusade, but his successors paid the price in political capital. The Jubilee years, established in 1300, brought pilgrims and money to Rome, but they also brought disease, crime, and chaos. Popes had to manage massive crowds while avoiding assassination attempts from people who used the chaos as cover. Even charity was dangerous. Popes who gave too generously to the poor were accused of wasting church resources. Those who didn't give enough were called misers and faced popular uprisings. There was no winning. Medieval theological disputes weren't academic debates. They were matters of life and death. Take the wrong position on an obscure point of doctrine, and you might find yourself poisoned. The iconoclasm controversy seems abstract to us. Should Christians venerate religious images or not? But Pope Stephen II faced Byzantine assassins over this issue. Supporting icons meant opposing the Byzantine emperor. That meant Byzantine agents trying to kill you. The Filioque controversy, whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, split Eastern and Western Christianity. Popes who tried to compromise faced opposition from both sides. Being theologically moderate was more dangerous than being an extremist. The investiture controversy wasn't just about appointing bishops. It was about whether spiritual or temporal power was supreme. Take the wrong side, and either the emperor or your own reformist cardinals would remove you. Dealing with heretical movements was especially dangerous. Be too harsh, and heretics might assassinate you. Be too lenient, and orthodox hardliners would claim you were a secret heretic yourself. The Cathars, Waldensians, and other movements all presented no-win scenarios. The Franciscan poverty disputes of the 13th and 14th centuries turned deadly. Was Christ poor? Did he own property? Academic questions? Except Franciscan extremists were willing to kill over them. Pope John XXII faced serious assassination attempts for taking the wrong position on apostolic poverty. Even calendar reform could be lethal. Different kingdoms calculated Easter differently. Try to standardize it, and you're accused of heresy by someone. The Pope couldn't even tell people what day to celebrate Easter without risking death. Being medieval Pope meant managing relationships with every Christian kingdom, plus dealing with Muslims, pagans, and the Byzantine Empire. Any diplomatic mistake could be fatal. The Byzantine emperors never accepted papal supremacy. They had their own patriarch and considered the Pope just another bishop, but they could project power into Italy. Disagree too strongly, and Byzantine agents would appear. Pope Silverius and Pope Martin I learned this the hard way. The Muslim conquest of the Holy Land created impossible dilemmas. Call a crusade and you're responsible for its failure. Don't call one and you're accused of abandoning Christianity. Try to negotiate with Muslims and you're a traitor. The Crusades killed more popes indirectly than any other policy. Dealing with the emerging European kingdoms was like juggling flaming swords. The French wanted papal support against the English. The English wanted support against the French. The Germans wanted support against everyone. Pick a side, make enemies. Stay neutral, everyone hates you. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century terrified everyone. Popes had to decide. Try to convert them, ally with them against Muslims, or call for resistance. Pope Innocent IV sent missionaries. When they failed, he faced criticism for not calling a crusade. When he did call for resistance, he was blamed for provoking Mongol attacks. Viking raids on church properties required responses. Be too militant and you're not Christian enough. Be too pacifist and monasteries burn while you do nothing. Pope Formosus tried to pay them off and was criticized for funding pagans. Spanish kingdoms wanted papal support for the Reconquista, but supporting wars against Spanish Muslims might anger Muslim rulers elsewhere who controlled Christian holy sites. Every foreign policy decision had deadly ramifications. The medieval papacy's violence had lasting effects. By the Renaissance, the position had become so associated with corruption and danger that reform became almost impossible. The Borgia popes of the late 1400s were just the logical conclusion of centuries of violence. The Protestant Reformation succeeded partly because people had lost faith in the papacy. When Martin Luther called the Pope the Antichrist, he was building on centuries of papal behavior that seemed anything but Christian. How could an institution that produced so many murdered and murdering popes claim moral authority? The territorial nature of the medieval papacy, the fact that popes were temporal rulers, created conflicts that lasted into the 20th century. The Roman question of papal territorial sovereignty wasn't resolved until the 1929 Lateran Treaty creating Vatican City. The practice of nepotism became so ingrained that it took centuries to root out. As late as the 1600s, cardinal nephews essentially ran the church. The word nepotism itself comes from the Italian nepete, nephew, specifically because of papal practices. The Western Schism's damage to papal credibility never fully healed. The idea that there could be multiple legitimate popes, that councils might be superior to popes, created theological problems that persist. Vatican I's declaration of papal infallibility in 1870 was partly an attempt to prevent another schism. Modern papal election secrecy and security procedures, the sealed conclave, the destruction of ballots, the careful protocols all stem from medieval violence. They're designed to prevent the intimidation, bribery, and murder that characterize medieval papal elections. So why would anyone want to be pope in the Middle Ages? Power, obviously. The position, despite its dangers, offered supreme authority over Western Christianity. For ambitious men, that was worth risking everything. Some genuinely believed they could reform the church. Gregory VII, despite dying in exile, pushed reforms that lasted. These idealists thought the spiritual rewards outweighed the physical dangers. They were usually wrong about the physical dangers part. Others were pushed into it by their families or factions. Refusing election might be as dangerous as accepting. If the powerful wanted you as pope, saying no wasn't really an option. But here's the remarkable thing. The institution survived. Despite the murders, the schisms, the anti-popes, and the corruption, the papacy endured. Each dead pope was replaced. The church continued. The fact that anyone was willing to take the job, knowing the risks, shows either remarkable faith or remarkable ambition. The medieval papacy was a masterclass in institutional survival, no matter how bad things got, and they got apocalyptically bad. There was always someone willing to put on the tiara. The position that killed so many somehow never stayed vacant for long. Today's popes face criticism, health challenges, and administrative headaches. They don't face poisoned figs, strangling cardinals, or armies besieging the Vatican. The Swiss Guard carries halberds mostly for show. Food tasters are no longer needed. But for 500 years, from 1000 to 1500, being pope meant accepting that your death would probably be violent, painful, and politically motivated. It meant ruling through fear while living in fear. It meant claiming to represent divine love while surrounded by very earthly hatred. The medieval papacy shows us that power, even spiritual power, comes with a price. And sometimes that price is everything. The men who wore the fisherman's ring during these centuries weren't just religious leaders. They were survivors in history's deadliest job. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the blood-soaked history of the medieval papacy. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe.